Okay, good afternoon, everybody. This is Matt Gordon with the Allegheny County Conservation District. I'm the regulatory team director. We'll go ahead and get started. It's a few minutes after 1. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to attend the webinar. Just last Friday, my coworker Maureen Copeland did a webinar on completing and submitting a Chapter 105 general permit registration to the district and tips on completing that permit. And as a follow-up paired to that, today's webinar is going to focus on common deficiencies we see at the Allegheny County Conservation District with submitted Chapter 105 general permits. The intended audience is for consultants who do submit Chapter 105 general permits. There is some background knowledge to know, but I will do a brief introduction, run down the regulations when permits are required, and then go through a couple common classes of deficiencies that we've seen over the years. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded onto our website. If you have any questions during the webinar, please just put them into the chat box. At the end of the presentation, we will go through and do a couple questions that you may have. Just get them entered into the chat box. And I also recommend you check out our website under Events and Education Resources. Within the past several months, we've uploaded several recorded webinars, pre-recorded PowerPoint presentations, some fact sheets that are resources to the public in general and also applicants and consultants seeking permits. So let's go ahead and get started. Just some review. Title 25 of the Pennsylvania Code contains all of Pennsylvania's environmental regulations. Within that, Chapter 105, Waterway Management, Dam Safety and Waterway Management regulates obstructions and encroachments. These are any activities or structures that would change the course, current, or cross-section of a stream, floodway, wetland, or body of water. The authority for the regulations, the actual laws that were passed, are the Clean Streams Law and the Dam Safety and Encroachments Act, as amended in part. And ACCD, like a lot of conservation districts statewide, has a delegation agreement with Department of Environmental Protection to administer certain aspects of the program. We've had our delegation since October of 2014. 105.11 lays out permit requirements. An individual entity may not construct, operate, maintain, modify, enlarge, or abandon a dam, water obstruction, or encroachment without first obtaining a written permit from the department. The regulations are further broken out by subchapter, defining different activities. There's a chapter on commercial dredging, for example, on enclosures, whenever 100 feet of stream will be lost in a culvert. That further goes on to outline permit requirements and design requirements. Locally here in Allegheny County, some of the different permit entities. For dam permits, all of those go through Division of Dam Safety, which is in Central Office DEP in Harrisburg. For the review of small projects permits, joint permits, and the general permits 10, 11, and 15. Those are reviewed at the regional DEP office in Pittsburgh. Oil and Gas Bureau also reviews 105 permits associated with oil and gas activities. And the Conservation District, under our delegation with DEP, receives and reviews general permits 1 through 9. .442 outlines the authority of the department to authorize general permits. These are for projects that are similar in nature, projects that can be adequately regulated using standardized specifications and conditions. And the projects, the registrations that are submitted, meet the specifications and conditions and will comply with the requirements for permit issuance. So the general permits cannot have special conditions written into them. There's standardized sets of conditions for each general permit activity. And when you're submitting a permit or submitting a permit on behalf of a client, what you're doing when you register that is showing us that the project as designed and spec'd out is going to meet all of those standard conditions in the general permit. This is a list of the 9 general permits that ACCD receives and reviews under our delegation with DEP. I mentioned earlier, we've had the delegation agreement since October of 2014. And it's interesting, when I was putting this together, I started running some different data pools. We have a cloud-based permit database, and from October 2014, we got the delegation, to the end of June 2020, the GP3, GP5, and GP7 made up approximately 78% of permits that have been submitted to the district. So when I went through some of these conditions and was going through common deficiencies, I focused on those at first, because they are, roughly 4/5 of what we see come into the office. Just some other historical data looking at the general permits we've received over the years for 105. By the end of June, 519 out of 822 GPs that were submitted had follow-up deficiency comments sent for them. 70 out of 822 general permits submitted have been withdrawn. There was something that made them ineligible for coverage in a lot of cases. And being nearly at 6 years with the delegation, we've noticed patterns of recurring deficiencies that come up over and over in reviewing these. For the purposes of this presentation, I broke those common deficiencies into 3 general buckets. The first one is an inability to meet GP conditions. To qualify for general permit coverage, the proposed activity has to meet all the specific conditions and requirements of that general permit. We see permits submitted that simply can't meet those general permit designs conditions, and they have to be sent on for a small projects or joint permit or GP11 from the regional office. The second common category is not accounting for all aquatic impacts, and that results in incorrect permit submissions. We get a permit submitted for a GP7, say, in a subdivision, but there are other impacts to 105 regulated areas, wetlands, streams, that would kick it out of coverage for just a GP7, would require other general permits, or possibly a different 105 permit from DEP. Also, waiver 2 considerations. The waiver 2 for obstructions in a stream with a drainage area of less than 100 acres. There is an overarching blanket statement with waiver 2 saying, upon complaint or inspection, if the DEP determines there's a substantial threat to the environment, people, property, or safety, something that would be otherwise waived could have a permit required, and that comes up in these reviews sometimes. And also missing or inadequate E&S plans. I'm not really going to get into E&S reviews. I think that's appropriate for an entirely separate presentation, but just that E&S plans are required and what needs to go in with them, we'll discuss that a little bit. So the first category, common deficiencies, the Chapter 105 general permit, what I've called limiting conditions. Again, over time, there's certain conditions we've noticed are difficult in the submission process when we review that we see this can't really be covered under a general permit because it violates one of the general permit conditions. Each of the general permits have conditions and sites where it doesn't apply. Then there are general conditions that apply to all of them, like E&S plan, having a PNDI, etc. And then there are specific conditions. So the specific conditions for GP3 are different than GP5, or different than GP7, etc. The ones I'm going to go over today are a subset of conditions for the most commonly submitted permits to our office under 105. So this is not an exhaustive list. Of course, before applying for a 105 permit, strongly recommend you read the entire conditions, areas where the general permit doesn't apply. As an applicant, to save time, or as a consultant, to save your client time and make sure you qualify for that general permit. But these are a few of the limiting conditions we've seen time and time again with the commonly submitted general permits. The general permit 3 for bank stabilization, rehabilitation, and gravel bar removal, a couple things that come up often. Condition B5, projects that involve channel relocation, realignment, or placement of fill to construct berms or levees is not covered under GP3. Somewhat common that we get in permits that in addition to stabilizing an eroding bank, the landowner has an interest in creating some type of berm or levee to raise the stream bank elevation so that in high flows their property does not flood. That would not be covered under GP3 and would need to go through the DEP for a permit. For removing gravel bars, removal of vegetated gravel bars is not covered under the GP3. That's defined in the permit as having 50% surface coverage of vegetation. If you're working for a client or want to submit a permit with gravel bar removal, that's fine to do within 6 inches of low flow. But if it's greater than 50% covered with vegetation, that would not be covered. Condition E8, slope protection should not be placed with an exterior steeper than 1.5 to 1. This comes up a lot of times with road projects. If it's a road that was built right next to a stream, there's not enough space. You can't have the grade, it's just not there to lay it back any farther. In those conditions, you can consider a wall or a gabion basket if you're proposing riprap initially, if you can't meet the slope requirement. Channel deflectors may not extend in the channel greater than 25% the width of the channel. You can use channel deflectors under GP3, but they have to meet that condition. If it's appropriate to have a larger channel deflector structure, consider applying for GP1. There are a lot of different approved structures by Fish and Boat that are deflectors that can be permitted, just not under GP3 if they extend more than 25% into the channel. And a really common one for walls that are proposed, the maximum height of a wall permitted under GP3 is limited to 6 feet, measured from the top of the wall to the bottom of the stream. If possible, you can minimize the height of the wall, reconsider design. A lot of times, if it's a really high eroded bank, it's just going to have to go the route of a joint permit, or if there is some other structure there that's being modified or replaced, the GP11. Just an example of a GP3 permitted project our office did. These blocks about 20 inches, so meet the height requirement of under 6 feet from the stream bed to the top of the wall. The top of the wall here, you notice, ties right in with the existing height of the stream bank, so there's not a berm or levee. They're using their E&S controls, so this was permitted and qualified for GP3. This is a cross-section of a drawing that was submitted for proposed coverage under GP3 to our office. This permit registration was eventually withdrawn. It's difficult to see, I know, when I stretch the photo out, but on the outside, the height of the wall from stream bed to top of the wall is 11 feet. Additionally, it doesn't tie in with the existing parking lot there, the asphalt surface. It's about 2 feet from the top of bank to the top of the wall, acting as a berm or levee. So this project cannot be covered under GP3. We would write a letter explaining the conditions, and this was withdrawn and resubmitted to DEP as a joint permit. The GP5 utility line stream crossings, there aren't many conditions in this that are strict that limit issuance, but it does come up often, and it's usually one of these two conditions, especially the first one. 12B for crossing under a stream bed with a utility, a minimum of 3 feet cover from the top of the utility to the bottom of the stream bed is required, or it can be 1 foot in bedrock. Especially comes up with sanitary sewer designs. If there are existing manholes, it might just be impossible if the stream's degraded and been down cut over time. to meet that grade in a replacement. For newer lines, it's pretty straightforward typically to meet. Condition 12K, utility line crossings of streams should be accomplished so the line is at a right angle to the stream bank. The purpose is to, straight line, shortest point, minimize disturbance in the stream. If there's something that it's a little bit off, the condition to say should be accomplished. If it's 89, 85 degrees, deviates slightly from that, there's something local with the topography that makes it impossible to do a 90-degree angle, we typically cover that. If it's proposed to run down the middle of the stream or something where there's really extensive disturbance, or it's crossing at a 30 or 20-degree angle and it's within the stream for a long time, that would not be covered under GP5, and we need a different DEP permit. So an example showing the importance of that condition and the minimum cover. It's a gas line that during some of the heavy storms the last couple of years has been exposed over time. It wasn't buried deep enough beneath the stream bed, and the heavier storms with down cutting exposed it, creating a environmental public safety risk if something came and broke that gas line. So to be covered under GP5, this would need at least 3 feet below the bed of the stream until the top of the utility, or if that's bedrock, 1 foot below the stream. GP7 limiting conditions. The GP7 is for minor road crossings. The GP7 has a lot of conditions compared to the other general permits we review, and tends to be difficult to meet all the conditions. There are several limiting conditions that come up in the review of these. First off, the GP7 does not cover stream enclosures. If a culvert over 100 feet is proposed, it's going to have to be a small projects or joint permit. Any crossing where the upstream watershed drainage area is greater than a square mile cannot be covered under GP7. During review, we just use USGS stream stats to obtain a drainage area to make sure it is under that square mile threshold. Additionally, if the channel and floodplain is delineated as a floodway on FEMA flood insurance rate maps, GP7 is not applicable for a minor road crossing. So be sure before submitting with these to check the FEMA firm panel to make sure you're not in a delineated floodway. Condition 13S, the length of culvert is only what is necessary for adequate road width and stable side slopes. This comes up periodically. The GP7 is for a minor road crossing. That's what the permit registration authorizes. It's not for a yard extension, cleaning up a stream, putting a stream in a backyard underground so somebody can build a barn or shed. It's specifically for road access, and the impact and length of culvert should be minimized to what is necessary for adequate road width and stable side slopes. Depth of fill covering the culverts shall not exceed minimum cover required by current manufacturer specification for intended use. This is problematic around here because of local topography. We tend to have steep valleys. I know there are also constraints that come up with local municipal requirements for driveway or road steepness, that a lot of times it's easier to put a pipe at the bottom and have a lot of fill over it, but that cannot be covered under GP7. We'd ask for some type of clarification or a spec sheet from the manufacturer for the intended use, if it's commercial or industrial, what the amount of fill over that culvert should be. Just some examples of projects, why these conditions are there with the depth of fill. On the left is a small backyard access to the other side of the property with about a 12-inch pipe and 8 feet of fill over it. The 8 feet of fill actually brings the grade higher than the neighbors in that little stream valley. And when this clogs, it backs up water and actually backs water up onto the neighbors, and this is currently a compliant site that has to submit a joint permit for designing a new culvert or doing a stream restoration. The picture on the right, when I took this picture, I was standing on a road grade, and about 15 feet vertically down, there's a clogged 24-inch concrete culvert. With that much fill, it's very difficult to maintain, and that's why these have to go through a joint permit review and have really specific requirements for operation and maintenance. This was also a compliant site, and earlier this summer this got taken care of and ameliorated. They dredged down, opened the pipe, and did a restoration here. There were several sanitary manholes underwater, and the road berm was acting as a dam, which it clearly wasn't designed for as a public safety issue. The second major class of common deficiencies is not accounting for all aquatic impacts when we review a permit. So 105 regulates the stream channel itself, the 100-year floodway, and if there are any present, any wetlands, whether within a stream or located far away from a stream. And we see projects where there are additional aquatic impacts that aren't accounted for in the permit. That could result in needing additional general permits, could result in it needing a joint permit or something else from the regional office, and it happens somewhat frequently. As an example, this was a drawing submitted for a general permit 7 and 5 to our office. And the general permit 7 covered this culvert crossing. You see there's a gas, sanitary, some utility crossings, but there are a lot of other impacts here in 105 regulated areas that could not be covered under the GP5 and the GP7. For the edge of this house is proposed 20 feet from the edge of a stream. You can see the assumed floodway limit of 50 feet. There's a substantial amount of fill where this road curves around for a building pad, and that fill is all in the assumed floodway of this unnamed tributary. So in this case, this development cannot be covered under GP5, GP7, and would need a joint permit submission. This was also submitted to our office as a GP7. See the culvert here, some fill on the slope that's impacting wetlands. GP7 does allow wetlands impacts, that's okay. But again, the minimum impact for a stable road crossing, they didn't account for all of their aquatic impacts. The fill up here that's in wetlands and goes to the edge of the stream, 1 is within the wetlands, 2 within the 100-year floodway. And this really isn't associated with the crossing. I mean, it's not filled down to here to get away from there. This is fill for building pads once they get across the road. And GP7 wouldn't cover fill in wetlands in the 100-year floodway for development of commercial or residential space. I mentioned earlier waiver 2. This was an NPDES project recently submitted to our office that proposed all of its aquatic impacts as covered by waiver 2, which is any obstruction in streams to less than 100 acres drainage area. But again, all of the waivers under 105.12a have a blanket statement saying if upon complaint or inspection, DEP could require a permit for something that's otherwise waived if they determine there's a substantial impact to safety, property, people, the environment. In this particular case, this is a snapshot of some of the aquatic impacts, but there are several culverts here on a smaller under 100 acre drainage area stream. There's fill here in the assumed floodway of the stream. It then goes back into a culvert down here. And after reviewing this, DEP made the determination this is not covered by waiver 2 and will require joint permitting, 105 permitting. So just be aware before submitting anything that that's a possibility with things that you intend to cover under waiver 2. Typically for smaller impacts on warm water fishery streams, say a single utility crossing that's really limited disturbance, or a basin outfall in a stream less than 100 acres drainage area that's just a riprap apron, that's more likely in the eyes of the department to have a small impact on the environment, people, safety, health, property. But once you start having hundreds of linear feet of impact or a lot of fill or special protection watersheds, things like that, it is always possible DEP can require a permit for something that otherwise would be waived. Finally, Chapter 105 general permits and erosion and sediment pollution control plans. We still have permits submitted without E&S plans, or will have to discuss with a consultant or an applicant before submitting why they need an E&S plan. So there's a citation in the regulations themselves that application for a permit shall be accompanied by proof of application for either a permit or an E&S control plan for activities in the stream and earth moving activities. So there's a regulatory citation in 105 about the requirements for a 102 plan. And in each and every single one of the general permits themselves, there's a condition that's the same or similar to this one I copied and pasted from the GP3, that work must be done in compliance with Chapter 102, and prior to construction, E&S plan must be reviewed and determined adequate and implemented before, during, and after construction. So E&S plans are required for Chapter 105 general permits. If the 105 permits are coordinated and associated with a 102 permitted activity, such as an NPDS, construction stormwater permit, or an ESCGP3, the appropriate BMPs, sequencing, etc., can just be included with the 102 permit E&S plan. That 105 activity is then covered by a reviewed and approved E&S plan as part of the bigger NPDES E&S plan. But if it's not coordinated with the 102 permitted activity and you're submitting a Chapter 105 general permit registration, it still requires a specific E&S plan to be submitted and reviewed. And we often get questions, well, what do I have to submit for that type of E&S plan? How much do I have to include with that type of E&S plan? So 102.4B5 lists the requirements for a written E&S plan. We expect the same format and inclusions that are listed there. It's the DEP's requirements under Chapter 102 for a written plan. There are 15 total items, but typically the Chapter 105 general permit E&S plans are substantially less complex compared to a 102 permitted land development E&S plan. There typically aren't channels, traps, changes in impervious cover, stormwater requirements, basins, and so on. The 105 general permit E&S plans for smaller projects that don't trigger a 102 permit tend to be, dealing with base flow in the stream, sequence stabilization, perimeter controls, etc., stabilization details. So to write an E&S plan for a 105 general permit should follow the 15 items in 102.4B for a complete plan. And for the purposes of today, I think, E&S review for 105 permits is its own topic, but these are the requirements listed in 102.4B for erosion and sediment pollution control plan. Some of the ones I've bolded, they often, because of the nature of 105 activities that can be covered under general permits, don't trigger the need for this. So volume and rate of runoff from the project site and its upstream watershed area, you're typically not speccing out any channels or traps with these 105 general permit activities. So that could be NA and an E&S plan submission. Supporting calculations and measurements tend to be pretty limited. With riprap bank protection, maybe there's something, a justification on shear stress in the stream, something for silt fence or compost filter sock, specking out what the actual size that is, and providing justification with slope length and slope percent, but not compared to, say, an NPDS with basins and traps and channels. Naturally occurring geologic formations. For certain activities, say a dock on the river, where it's just building a wooden dock that maybe has a single pile driven into the riverbed, wouldn't really expect a really in-depth geological formation analysis. For something like a riprap apron, that's just going to be at grade from storm discharge, just showing the calculation for, justification for the riprap apron, even the E&S manual. But, if there's no excavation or anything, not an in-depth soil or geological analysis. Thermal impacts with 105 a lot of time are just restored or NA, and because it's not a permit for PCSM plan coordination, if you're under an acre, 102 doesn't require for most all activities a PCSM plan or stormwater requirements. There wouldn't be coordination with the PCSM plan. And similarly, for existing and proposed riparian buffers, there are requirements in 102 to stay at least 150 feet away from a special protection watershed. And if you're within that, there's a mitigation or BMP process to show that what you're proposing is at least protective as the existing riparian forest buffer. But being under an acre and not having a permit requirement for, say, an outfall or a dock or something like that, it wouldn't trigger that 102 need. So those are a few of the common ones we see time and time again with the permits we review, especially the GP3, 5, and 7, some of those limiting conditions. Of course, that was only a subset. Before submitting a 105 general permit to our office or DEP or another conservation district, of course, strongly recommend reading over all the terms and conditions to make sure the permit's applicable. Those are just a few of the limiting ones we see time and time again. And if you have any questions as you go through permits or before submitting a permit, our office does still hold open door Thursdays. We've been doing teleconference pre-application meetings. And also always available for phone or email for any 105 permitting questions. So with that, I'll turn it over to Maureen. We could take a few questions off of the chat box if there are any.
Yeah, Matt, thanks. We do have one question in the chat box, and if folks have others, feel free to add them in now. But the one that is currently in the chat box is regarding horizontal drilling. If you're doing an HDD plan for water or sewer, not necessarily oil and gas, is an IR plan required with the submission for a GP5?
Yeah, they are. The department has asked us to get those for IR plans if it's going to be, drilling under pressure with mud. Our guidance for what to include has been from the department, their comments from the Sunoco Mariner 2 line. There were a lot of problems and pollution with that. And through the regional office review in Southwest, but also with South Central for that particular project, they made temporary guidelines or guidance on what to include with an IR E&S plan. And it's my understanding the department is working on a more official memo on what needs to be in an E&S plan when there's a, to address inadvertent returns for horizontal drilling operations.
That is all the questions currently in the chat. Like I said, if someone has more, feel free to add them. Otherwise, Matt's email is there.
Yeah, feel free to email any follow-ups. We can give an extra minute too. Again, I would just encourage everybody to visit our website, accdpa.org, under resources, or excuse me, under events and education and resources. These recorded webinars and some other recorded material gets uploaded periodically, so do go check that out for other presentations and resources.
Matt, we got another question come in. Should the IR plans come from the contractors? These are, or should they come from the consultants themselves?
You know, before we approve an ENS plan that proposes HDDs, we'd want to see it. It is my experience that certain gas utilities have a company-wide IR plan for HDD operations that are pretty standardized, but you know, if there is one, stop, isolate, clean it up, report, etc. So whether it comes from the contractor or the consulting firm, so long as it met the draft DEP guidance that they went through with Sunoco on the Mariner 2 project, we would accept it.
And then another question came in, if there were any GP8 issues that you see often.
I don't know if there are patterns of recurring conditions with GP8, but some of the things that have come up in the past with GP8, it only authorizes up to 200 feet of a wetland crossing. So I've seen a few projects over the years where typically, you know, right away alignment, there wasn't any way to get out of a crossing less than 200 feet. So that would trigger, you know, breaking the GP8 condition and having to go to DEP. Any of the crossings you want to see, like a multiple culvert crossing, slightly depressed in the middle so that, you know, during high flows, it'll just be overtopped. But typically that type of comment can be addressed. Being in year for one place, you know, unless it's set up front, we need this for 4 years. We wouldn't necessarily know about it. But over the years, I've had plenty of GPA temporary crossings. They're allowed to be left in 1 year from the date of approval, and they can be extended if there's a request in writing for another year. But I've had several site inspections over the years where the crossing is left in beyond that, construction's not completed, and they have to reapply for GPA.
Another question came in, Matt. How often do you seek input from the statewide regional office when a waiver 2 impact is included in a PAGO2 or NPDS application?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, the way the waiver is written, it's just obstructions and streams less than 100 acres drainage area. And again, that blanket statement that upon complaint or inspection, the region can require a permit. So I'd say when we specifically seek input is when we're uncomfortable with the amount of impacts. The thing that's hard about Chapter 105 in the regulations, there's not specific guidance about what DEP would consider a substantial threat to property, the environment, etc. But I think most of our reviewers, if there's a utility line crossing or an outfall, so there's a very small impact to say a 10 or 15 acre stream, in that case, we wouldn't probably consult the region. Might come up in review, but we wouldn't consult the region for, you know, getting a formal written acknowledgement of that waiver use. But in the example I showed, you know, once there are, I think cumulatively there was like close to 300 feet of stream piped. I mean, that's a pretty substantial impact. So if the reviewer feels like this is kind of stretching, the intentional waiver to, and there's a substantial environmental impact and a lot of aquatic impacts, at that point, we could and do formally ask the applicant, their consultant, to get some written acknowledgement that a waiver to would be approved for that activity.
That is all the questions currently in the chat, Matt. So.
Okay. Well, my email's up there. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out. Or for anything else, or 102, 105 related to the Conservation District. Again, do check out our website. We are periodically adding fact sheets, recorded PowerPoint presentations, and these webinar recordings. Hope to keep building that library. Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for attending.